The reason I want to talk specifically about this year of the Civil War is because everything sort of shifts and everything changes during this year. So let's take kind of a broad look at some of the things that change. Take a look at these four pictures. Can you identify just by looking at these pictures which wars we're basically talking about here?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
So somebody tell me which war this probably is.
Trench warfare, World War I.
Okay, Jordan says this
Afghanistan
is
is
World
gonna
War I.
bottom.
Yeah, pretty much. Looks like World War I. How about this one? Can you figure out which this one is? This bottom right corner?
Probably Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, fighting in the Middle East, modern day, kind of like, you know, late 90s, early 2000s, fighting in the Middle East. What about this one here? Can you identify this one? Yeah, you see knights with like helmets. This is actually the Civil War in England is when this is, and you can kind of tell from the hats, but there's no difference between the Civil War in England in the 1600s and the 30 Years War, and they all kind of stayed the same for 100 years or so. So yeah, okay, fighting in the Middle Ages. What about this one up here? What about the top right?
Revolution.
Yeah, Revolutionary War. What is it about these things that makes it obvious what it is we're talking about?
They have
Uniforms?
actual military uniform.
All right, I heard Joseph, uniforms, or possibly Andrew, I don't know. I heard uniforms. The uniforms are really obvious. What else do you see that tells you which war is happening here? Their hats are part of their uniforms.
Weapons?
They're very organized.
Okay, how they're organized, what kind of weapons they're using. Yeah, I mean, there are things that really identify different wars to us. And I think one of the most startling things about the Civil War is it doesn't have that. The Civil War, you can identify a Civil War battle by the uniforms. You can see uniforms and be like, well, there's blue and there's gray. But other than that, how they're fighting on the field, you can't use that because every kind of fighting existed during the Civil War. They shifted from one to the other. At the start of the war, there were only about 16,000 men in the U.S. Army, in the Federal Army, on the Union side, and then there were small state militias in the South. Okay, so at the beginning of the Civil War, the federal government had an army of about 16,000 men, which sounds like a lot, but it's really, really not. And the southern states had small state militias, and that's all they had because all of the standing army soldiers belonged to the Union. They both had a bunch of volunteers at the beginning, but then halfway through the war, they both had to start to institute a draft, and hundreds of thousands of people tried to dodge the draft. You'll know what a draft is, right? And I hope some of you are young enough that I look and I think y'all have never lived where there's a draft, but where you're called up to service whether you want to go or not. Say again, Jordan?
Deserters were a big thing back then too.
Mm-hmm. Draft dodging was a career, so we'll talk about that. Immigrants joined the fight on both sides. During this time, we're still experiencing a wave of immigrants from Europe. People who are fleeing from Germany, people who are fleeing from Ireland, they're still flooding in. And depending on where they happen to come in, they join one side or the other. The Irish immigrants joined the Union forces out of New York, and some of them immediately flee south and join the Confederate forces. And it's not because they feel one side is stronger than the other, it's just opportunistic. It's just kind of where they end up. They get sort of pressed into service wherever they are. So by the end of the Civil War, which started off with 16,000 men and a bunch of state militias, you end up with 2.2 million Union soldiers and 1 million Confederate soldiers. And by the end of the war, each one of these armies, the Union Army and the Confederate Army, are arguably stronger than any other military in the world. Okay, a historian of the time measured the battle tactics of the Union and the Confederate forces against each other and said they could have wiped out Prussia on the field if they'd ever come face to face with the Prussian army, which was the strongest military in Europe. So both the Union and the Confederacy ended up with the strongest militaries in the world, and they faced off against each other by the end of the war. One of the reasons for this was weapons technology. The Civil War started with muskets that basically have you all ever seen somebody load a musket? How long it takes to load a musket? All of the pieces that are involved. You pull this open, you pull that off, and then you have to dump the powder in, and then you have to tamp down this, and then you have to do that, and then you can fire. Like loading a
Yeah.
musket, forever. And after
So there's
all that work, after it reaches about 100 yards, it's no longer harmful. Like it hits the person and bounces off. Okay, so that was what they started off with weapons technology at the beginning of the Civil War. But early in the Civil War, they began to develop rifled muskets. Okay, rifling a musket means to add a spiral on the inside of the barrel. Do you see how this works? What happens when you spiral throw a football? If anybody play football? No football players. Okay, what happens if you just throw a football without thinking about it? Right? Well, what happens if you put a good tight spiral on it? Yeah, distance and accuracy. It's easier to aim. It's easier to carry the arc. It goes for further. The same is true of bullets. The same thing is true of rifled muskets inside a bullet. If it spins the whole time it's leaving the barrel of the rifle, then it goes further and with more accuracy. So muskets can shoot about 100 yards before they become useless. Huh? We're going to talk about 1863, but 1862 is when rifled muskets started to come in. A rifled musket could shoot 800 to 1,000 yards, so 10 times the distance and still do damage, okay? So what does that do to a battlefield?
Expands it.
Think about this picture here that we had here and the American Revolution. What would that do to a battlefield to be able to go from 100 yards? Think about a football field is about 100 yards, right?
I'm going to stay the fuck away from you.
Exactly 100 yards, sorry. Okay, now take 10 football fields and imagine being able to aim that distance and still kill whoever you aim at. What does that do to your battlefields?
We're going to stay away from each other.
Yeah. Rifling the muskets was something that was done to cannons too. Now, I don't know if y'all remember us talking about the Gone to Texas, the cannon of Gonzales, the one that's the, come and take it cannon that was like this big from front to back, was this big and fired balls about that size. And everybody was like, ooh, that's a cannon and we have to defend it because it's a valuable weapon. By the middle of the Civil War, we've extended out cannons so that they are 6 to 8 feet long and the inside of them is rifled, okay, which means that they can fire 1,000, 2,000 yards and carry with force a cannonball all that distance over a long field, knock down buildings, puncture
So it's like an artillery cannon.
Say again, Jordan?
So it's like an artillery cannon?
Yeah, this is when we start to have actual artillery cannons, and it becomes a thing to have an artillery unit in your fighting field. Injuries don't just, from rifled cannons, they don't just puncture, they crush. So almost all of the injuries that are sustained on the battlefield result in amputation because they just really can't, they can't put your leg back together once it's been hit by a cannonball. If it didn't knock your leg clean off, it crushed all of the bones in it. So it makes a big difference to the type of fighting style because the battlefield is now much bigger than it was before because the distance you can hurt somebody is much bigger and because artillery is coming at you from unpredictable directions. Napoleonic fighting style, you would march your force onto a field and they'd march their force onto a field. You'd stop right outside of musket range, negotiate, and if that didn't work, then you would take turns firing on each other until somebody charged, and then you'd have hand-to-hand combat with the bayonets. So all Napoleonic fighting was set up this way. We march all of our troops out, we display them, and we stand there with great big red uniforms with white X's on our chests, making ourselves easy targets. And then we negotiate for who's going to, and then if there's no truce, then we march these forces at each other. And then we watch the flags to see who's still standing at the end.
Isn't that why
against the retreat, then the other force probably took the field. That doesn't work if you can cover 1,000 yards with a single rifle shot. If you can hit 1,000 yards, you can't see the enemy well enough to negotiate their forces at 1,000 yards. So the only way to have a battle is to charge at each other from the beginning. So what that causes is trench warfare. What people end up doing is building up defenses. So this is a picture It looks an awful lot like this picture from the picture from World War I I just showed you, but this is not World War I. This is the Civil War. This is trench warfare in the Civil War. Yes. Yeah, during the Revolution, the American forces engaged in guerrilla warfare. That was because the British kept marching through places with trees, and it was easy to sneak up on them by hiding in the trees, which was just improper and it was impolite. But it had nothing to do with the distance of the weapons. It had to do with the fact that they weren't waiting until they were on a battlefield to fight. They were doing it in the trees on the way to the battlefield, and that was just improper and rude. And those bloody Americans, anyway. So what we end up with in the Civil War is trench warfare by the end, digging into fortifications, building up behind walls, taking cover in the trees. Like there's no more, and there were still pitched battles on battlefields, but they usually followed a couple of days of this other thing. Another thing that changed during the Civil War was the invention of the prisoner of war. Okay. Up until this time, and for hundreds of years before this, when prisoners were taken in war, they were ransomed back. So in England, if a French knight was taken as a prisoner, he would be taken someplace to a location, a letter would be sent to his family, and he would be sent back and tagged out of the war. No more fighting for you. You're out, like in dodgeball, you're out. And then you were released. You were sent to back home, but you were expected not to come back to the fight. Okay. So that was what was the standard at the beginning of the Civil War too, is that when Confederate forces were taken by Union forces, they were returned home with the understanding that you're out now. You can go back to your farm, deal with your home life, don't get back on the battlefield because you have officially been tagged out. You've been paroled out. Okay. So, would forces abide by this? Not so much. People would still come back after they'd been paroled out, but for the most part, the fact that you were captured on the battlefield usually meant you were wounded, so that helped. But you were basically held until your ransom was paid. The Confederate government paid ransoms for captured Confederate soldiers. The Union government paid ransoms for captured Union soldiers, and then they were returned. And sometimes they were put back into play, but for the most part, they were out and replaced by other soldiers. This changed when the Union began to use black soldiers, which we're going to talk about exactly how that went down, because that was in 1863 that the Union actually started to build fighting units out of black men. And when that happened and they began to face off with the Confederate soldiers had a policy that when they captured a black soldier on the field, they could take that black soldier and put him back into slavery. Well, that's not ransoming. That's not paroling. You're not returning him back to where he came from. That's basically taking somebody and holding them prisoner forever. So the Union responded by saying, if that's what you're going to do with our soldiers, then that's what we're going to do with your soldiers. Hi. That's what we're going to do with your soldiers. If you're going to capture our soldiers and put them to work for you and make them imprisoned labor, then we're going to capture your soldiers and put them to work for us, and they're going to be imprisoned labor. And then we have the beginning of what are called POW camps. So prisoners of war that are held captive until the war is over and forced to do things for the opposing army was actually sort of invented during the Civil War as a result of this policy by Confederate soldiers. And it wasn't pretty. The black Union units that would march in, they knew that this was a possibility, that they could be captured and then, forced into slavery or forced back into slavery, depending on where they came from. There was a particular battle, I think it was in Arkansas. I'm pretty sure it was in Arkansas, where the Confederate forces rolled in and was defeated. And when they started rifling through the Confederate belongings, they found an entire wagon of shackles because they knew they were going to be facing off against a black unit when they arrived at this battlefield. Yeah, so they lost, but the Union army that was there was like, wow, they're really serious about this. And so we're going to talk about how that happened. One more change that happened is the leadership over the course of the Civil War. And this is, again, hundreds and hundreds of years before this. the leaders of all the military units of all of the European-centric countries of the world were the knights, the aristocracy, the rich people. They were the people who were always in charge. They were always the officers. Even up until past this point, if you wanted to be an officer in the British Army, you had to purchase your commission. Somebody had to sponsor you. There had to be wealth behind it. You couldn't just earn your way up. So, yeah, and you could. It still is, because people who manage to get into West Point often still have the backing of a well-established, entitled family, but it's not the only way to get in, and that changed during the Civil War. McClellan, for example, was appointed a military officer partly because he was old world Massachusetts. He was old aristocracy Massachusetts. He was given a high ranking at West Point. He was given everything he needed to graduate from West Point with honors. And then he was given a commission, because why wouldn't he be? He came from all the best families. But on the battlefield, McClellan was basically useless. I shouldn't say that. There's no such thing as an officer who's completely useless. But he had this really bad habit of riding up into a battle, taking a look at the Confederate forces, and then going, I need more men. I can't attack yet. I need more. There seems to be an enemy here, and I'm not sure I'm ready. And as a result, he gave away battle after battle after battle by allowing the Confederate forces to reinforce while he waited for Lincoln. As a matter of fact, Lincoln sent him a letter once and said, if you're not going to be using the army today, can I borrow it? You know, because McClellan kept stalling on his attacks. And the more he served, the more resentful he got of Lincoln, because Lincoln, to him, was a backwoodsman who had no education and had no family, and didn't deserve to be president over him. And as a result, he didn't have a whole lot of respect for his wishes. That's as opposed to Grant, who was the son of an Ohio tanner, who had managed to get into West Point and had had to climb his way up, who had rough manners. And then by the end of the war, men like Sherman, who was proud of his backwoodsman, frontiersman ancestry. He was proud of the fact that he was a Kentucky backwoodsman. He had no tolerance for people like McClellan. He had no respect for Lee. And from the very beginning of the war, he was telling people, this war is going to last and lots of people are going to die. And people were laughing at him and saying, you don't know what you're talking about. This war is going to be over by Christmas. We're going to get in and out of this war in no time at all. We're going to march in with our Union forces, and we're going to tell the Confederacy that what they've done is illegal, and they're going to go, sorry, our bad, and surrender and back off. Except that's not what happened. He was the one that was saying that the only way to convince the South to come back into the Union was to destroy them. And people thought he was crazy. So let's look at how that works out. Yeah. Okay, so in 1863, we've run out of volunteers. People are no longer volunteering because this was supposed to be over really fast, and it's already a year and a half in. The battlefields are much messier than everybody expected them to be. So in 1863 in New York City, only a few months after the Emancipation Proclamation goes out, the Union military institutes a draft, okay? And in New York City, and in several of the major urban centers, but in New York City especially, there is a massive riot in July protesting this draft. Part of the reason for that was because you could pay your way out of being drafted. Okay, if you had $300 back in those days, $300, then you could pay somebody to take your place. If you were the son of a rich man and you got drafted, then you can pay a poor man to take your place. You could pay a fee and that poor man could take your place. Which meant that only the poor working class ended up being recruited, because everybody that could afford to just bought their way out of it. And the poor working class was largely made up of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, places like that, who already resented the black population in those cities, because they were competing with them for employment. They were competing with them for all kinds of things. And so now they perceived it that they were being forced to go to war after the Emancipation Proclamation, that they were being forced to go to war, and these other guys weren't. So they were going to have to leave their city and go to war for a fight they didn't particularly support in order to fight for the rights of a people that were already stealing jobs for them in these cities. So there is a riot, and in this riot, working class white men, massive violence that was mostly targeting free blacks that were living in the city of New York City. At least 120 people were killed, and at least 11 black men were lynched during these draft riots. But as a result of these draft riots, people begin to talk about other possibilities for fighting force to go in and fight the Union. One of the things that gets a lot of progress during that draft riot was maybe we should be letting the black men fight. Maybe we should be organizing them into fighting units too. They were asking to be allowed to fight. They were asking to be allowed to go to war, and they were not being allowed to. Anybody want to guess why there was so much resistance in the Union for allowing black men to take up arms and go to war? Anybody want to guess?
They're taking up arms and going to war.
It's that whole thing where you give them weapons. Yeah. Yeah, it's that whole idea of giving weapons to, because there was an overwhelming movement of abolitionism in the North, but there was still massive racism. Slavery might be wrong, but I mean, there's still a decided superiority and inferiority here. White people should still be in charge. So there was already this idea that if you give them weapons now, they'll fight on the side of the Union now, but what will they do later? So in 1862, at the very end of 1862, the Confederate Army scored a large victory against the Union forces at Fredericksburg. And this was probably one of the battles where it was really obvious that the entire style of war had changed. They planned to march out onto a field. There was a field. It was not level. There was a high ground and a low ground, and there was a wall in the middle of it. The Confederate forces took the high ground behind the wall and basically rained horror down onto the Union forces and wiped them out. And the 12,000 dead at Fredericksburg changed the conversation about what this war was actually doing. If the Confederate forces are willing to just, park on a field and wipe out 12,000 of their countrymen, then maybe they really are actually not just a small group of rebel governments. Maybe they're actually an army that we need to deal with. At Chancellorsville, Jackson died of infectious pneumonia. We talked about that on Friday. So the Holy Trinity of the Confederate forces are, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are Lee, Jeb Stuart, and Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson gets shot and killed. Jeb Stuart rides out on his own because he's in charge of the cavalry. That's why he's the Holy Spirit, is because he can disappear and reappear. And he rides out on his own on a campaign of harassment up in the Ohio River Valley and stops reporting back to Lee. And as a result, his job is supposed to be to harass the Union Army, but his job is also supposed to be to keep an eye on the Union Army, to figure out where they're going and which direction they're going to be attacking from. And the reason he can do that is because his men are on horseback. They can ride out and ride back really quickly and report back to Lee, but he doesn't. And as a result, Lee loses faith in Jeb Stuart and starts to have to rely on his own generals, the generals that he has, including, what was his name? I'll have to find it, but I'm drawing a complete blank on this guy's name. I want to say it's Hightower, but that's not right. I'll have to look it up. I'll look it up and figure it out. But whoever it is he's a general who believes in the defensive strategy of the Confederacy. He believes that they should pull back, they should defend the border, and they shouldn't be too proactive, that their whole job is supposed to defend. And Lee comes to rely very heavily on him. So during this time in the Union, McClellan finally gets fired. After the Battle of Antietam, the one where they decided to do the Emancipation Proclamation, McClellan technically won that battle, but then he let the Confederate forces retreat and he didn't chase them. And as a result, they lost the only advantage they ever had during the first year of the war. And so Lincoln finally gets tired of that and fires McClellan. And then a series of generals takes over the Union Army, one after another, and they all run into the same problems, and they all end up passing the torch to the next person. So Burnside and then Thomas Hooker. Finally, it falls to George Meade. who takes command of the Army of the Potomac. He's old world Massachusetts abolitionist, but he is also himself, he's pretty smart in the way that he handles. One of the things that he does that the other commanders weren't very good at is he delegates. He recognizes when he has a good officer and he allows them to do them. So as a result of all this maneuvering around, General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia amasses just south of the border of Pennsylvania, while George Meade's Union Army of the Potomac amasses just north of it, and they end up tripping into each other at Gettysburg. They end up basically parking right across the town from each other, and then realizing that what is across the town from them is the entire army of the Potomac and the entire Army of Northern Virginia. So this is it. This is the big moment that they feel like they have a chance to face off and actually have a definitive victory one way or the other. The goal of the Confederacy during this interaction is to defeat the Army of the Potomac, pass through Virginia, walk into Washington, D.C., and place a demand for surrender on Abraham Lincoln's desk. That's their plan. Obviously, Meade's plan is to stop them and push them back across the border. So they meet in Gettysburg, and a number of really interesting things happen. Like I said, one of George Meade's strengths, yes, go back? Sure. One of George Meade's strengths is that he recognizes when he has an officer who can figure things out on their own. So he takes his officers and he positions them in Gettysburg, some of them in the town and some of them on the hills outside of the town. While the Confederate forces are amassing, a Union officer holds the high ground outside the town and manages to hold on to it even though they get pushed. He basically takes the high ground right outside the town, and then he gets pushed to the high ground behind the high ground right outside the town, which is better high ground anyway. And the Confederate forces could have gone around behind them and taken that better high ground, but they were too busy having a face-to-face fight and enjoying themselves with what they thought was just a small contingent, not realizing that the entire Army of the Potomac was behind them. So this is my favorite part of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's the Battle of Little Round Top. This guy, Joshua Chamberlain, was a professor at a university. He was an abolitionist, but that wasn't why he joined the war. He joined the war because he really genuinely believed in liberating the Southerners from those rebellious governmental people. He was an abolitionist. He did believe that slavery was bad, but why he joined the war was to set people free. And a lot of people have taken his speeches out of context and said he obviously went to war to save Black people from slavery, but actually he believed in freeing the Southern people from those rebellious governments and bringing them back to the United States where they belonged. But he was a professor who had studied classic Roman history. And so he actually employed a battle tactic that he had pulled from antiquity, from, no, not from Caesar, Marcus Aurelius, I think, from antiquity. Basically what he did was that he circled his forces into a great big circle on the top of the top of Little Round Top, this little hill. And as the Confederate forces came up the hill, he swung his forces down like a big door, unrolled them, basically. He unrolled them. This is, okay, let me see. Where is he? Okay. He's only one small part of this up here. Yeah, he's down here, Little Round Top. Okay, so he was told that under no circumstances could he allow the Confederate forces to get around Little Round Top. So his job was to guard this part right here and make sure they didn't flank. Well, you would have thought that what he would have done was make a solid wall out of his men and just, you know, hold out as long as he could. But instead, he tucked them backwards like this in a great big line. And when the Confederate forces came up the hill, he opened it like a door and swung around and drove them back down the hill. And from above, it probably looked like really interesting. But he used nobody really had a whole lot of faith in his abilities because he was a professor. But that's why he's one of my favorite fighters in the Civil War, because he was a studier of history who employed his knowledge on the battlefield. He was a philosophy and rhetoric major who had studied history. There were other places where small victories were happening all over the place. Another battle that takes place during this is the Combahee Ferry Raid. And this was a tactic that Harriet Tubman put into play, using the knowledge that she had from sneaking onto plantations and raiding them for slaves and leading slaves to freedom. She pointed to a particularly vulnerable spot on the James River where if all of the slaves were to run at the same time, then the forces that were amassed there would have to chase them and then could be led directly into a trap. So they parked naval forces on the river, and she got word to the slaves to when they should run, and they did. And as a result, they were able to attack this series of plantations and cripple one of the major supply lines that was leading into the Civil War. Numbers have about 700 slaves being saved in that one action. That's an anecdotal number, but it's probably pretty close. I don't know. It's a good question. But they were actually freeing them too. And they did cripple the agriculture along that river. So that was a major supply line for food for the Confederate Army that they crippled. And they were able to take out a fort, or not a fort, but a holding where troops were amassing. So that was actually the one and only time that a woman has been put in charge of a federal military operation during a war. Harriet Tubman. Anyway, so let's talk about what happened when the Union began to build units out of black men. The first regiment to be formed entirely out of black soldiers was in Massachusetts. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania are the two biggest abolitionist areas in the North. And so they have people, Frederick Douglass, for example, who's immediately petitioning for them to be allowed to go and take up arms against the South and free their families. But it takes a while for people to be able to do it. Some concessions are made right from the get-go. And if you really want to watch a good movie about this, I recommend Glory. They don't get everything right, but it's a movie that came out in the late 80s, I think, called Glory, in which they talk about this first regiment of black soldiers. There are a couple of things they notice right off the bat. First of all, white officers who are not engaged directly with the black soldiers are very, very suspicious of them. They have very little, they have very little faith in their abilities, which is odd because for a lot of these men, following instructions and performing, labor under strict instruction was kind of like their whole life. So they were paid $10 instead of $13. If they were captured, they faced the possibility of being re-enslaved. So being a black soldier was incredibly dangerous. You weren't even really safe from your own military countrymen. You weren't even really safe from other Union soldiers, from being harassed from other Union soldiers. And there were no officers. All the officers were white. So the officers of the black regiments were all white officers, up to a point. Then something happened, and I studied this at length because I just thought it was really fascinating, where black soldiers lost their white officer in a major battle. This regiment in Massachusetts lost their officer in a major battle, an attack on a fort, and to comfort them, they had a black chaplain appointed to their regiment. And that black chaplain, by definition, was a major, because you can't be a chaplain and not be a major. So he was the first black officer appointed, and that made it possible for them to say, well, we can appoint other chaplains across the Union Army. So there were 14 black chaplains that were appointed to the Union Army. Okay. I want you to take a look at these two cartoons. At the very beginning of the war, these were things that were published in northern newspapers about what it was going to look like when black soldiers started joining the fight. What do you see? Do these look like competent, capable soldiers? Are they being portrayed as, what do you see back here? See people falling down?
It's looking like they don't really care about this stuff. Basically,
right, they look like the newspapers are basically making fun of them. Like, this is what it's going to look like when black soldiers join the war. This is ridiculous. It's going to be funny and comedic and not at all serious. After that attack on the fort by the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, which was the first Black regiment, this was what was being published in the newspapers. Now, what do you see? I mean, this is a portrait. This is a Harper's Weekly illustration of the attack on the fort, on Fort Wagner, by the 54th Massachusetts. So this was published. This was somebody's impression of what they saw on the battlefield that day. Now, compared to the soldiers in this picture here. Anyway, so knowing that they could get captured, re-enslaved, knowing that they had to basically fight or die on the battlefield, 500,000 Black soldiers joined the Union Army, and that turned the whole tide of the war. So at Gettysburg, we're going to just talk, well, I'm just going to show you this clip because we just have enough time to finish it, I think. But I'm going to show you this clip of the Gettysburg Address. The Union Army obviously won. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Here, let me fix this. This is not from a movie, this is from a documentary. Okay, let me get this up where you can watch it. This is 5 minutes long. This is just going to talk about the speech that the president gave at Gettysburg after the war had been fought, which y'all should probably know. I imagine you know. If you don't,